Welcome to Celebrating Act Two with John Mariani, the Virtual Gourmet, one of our favorite people for food, drink, and just wonderful stories.
Mine too.
Hey, John, as you know, I read your newsletter, The Virtual Gourmet. I am a religious reader of it. Virtual Gourmet available for free, by the way, folks, at johnmariani.com. And I was fascinated by a recent story about the world, see if I got this right, the World Atlas of Whisky. There's a World Atlas for whiskey. How many whiskeys are there? I mean,
well, it used to be kind of a thin book. This is the third edition. And when it first came out, I don't know when the first edition came out, it was probably 25, 30 years ago.
Wow.
It wasn't a very thick book. This one is a massive book like this, and it's written by Dave Broom, and it took 10 years for him to compile because things have changed so radically in the whiskey world. Whiskey, is really basically brown goods. I mean, this vodka I have here is not really whiskey. Those are spirits of another kind. But brown goods, if you recall, back in the 80s, even well into the 90s, talking about Scotch, talking about Irish whiskey, talking about rye, rum, bourbon. Those were passé. Those were your grandfather's or your father's drinks. My father always had a bottle of black and white or Dewar's on the cupboard at home. There was no such thing as single malts and special artisanal whiskeys and so forth. And it is still true today that vodka and white rum, because of mixed drinks, are by far the best-selling spirits in the world, much more so than the brown goods. But the so-called brown goods took a leap upward at the late 80s and 90s, and I give it to one man to kind of jumpstart a new interest. And he's certainly in the book, this World Atlas of Whisky, and his name was Bill Samuels Jr. And his father had started a small bourbon distillery outside of Lexington, Kentucky, called Maker's Mark. And Bill was not a whiskey maker. Bill was a guy who knew how to market things, and he took ads in the New Yorker magazine about how to make the perfect mint julep. And he was a very funny guy. And he says, as everybody knows here down in the South, that you have to use a Hanes number 10 undershirt in which you put the fresh spring mint to squeeze it. And it was very, very funny. This thing took off. He also dipped the bottles in red wax. So it's a distinctive product. This took off. And the bourbon industry has just exploded ever since. I mean, it's astonishing how many bourbons are also. So much so, quite literally, that Lexington, Kentucky, and Louisville, Kentucky are now major tourist stops to go on the so-called whiskey trail. Concomitant to that, can I say the word concomitant on the air?
Yeah, you can. On this show, you can. Yeah.
Yeah, this is not a family show.
Concomitant to that, the Scotch distilleries, of which there were very, very few, and they were ancient, decided we've got to get in on something. We've got to make Dewar's and black and white and these kind of cheap but good blended whiskeys, some of which were titled premium if they went above $9. We got to get this thing kickstarted. So they came up with the Scotch Whiskey Trail, just as they have the Bourbon Whiskey Trail in Kentucky. And you could go on it from distillery. And it wasn't a very big trail because there weren't that many distilleries at that time. The Irish caught on to it too. But what the Scotch people did was came up with single malts. Who ever heard of a single malt? I never did when I was growing up. A single malt? But in other words, the more prestige, the better labels, the better stoppers, and the smaller artisanal whiskeys they were putting in, declaring 20-year-old. Well, 20-year-old means that's the youngest. in the bottle. Okay, that's how blending happens. Vintage Scotch, which is nonsense, because a master distillery, a master blender is a blender. He's not a guy who just pours stuff into a bottle. Anyway, this is how it all began. Well, the Japanese, who'd been making whiskey for a long time, the Japanese got into it. And while they can't call it Scotch, they call it Japanese whiskey. The stuff's very good. They make a lot of excellent stuff that wins contests, blind contests against Scotch whiskey. Irish whiskey, remember Paddy's and Powers and all of those, which were cheap Irish whiskeys, are now Jameson, which was the leader. Well, Jameson now has about 10 or 20 iterations. There's the blue bottle, the green bottle, the red bottle, the silver bottle, the platinum bottle. And so in other words, all of these things were being enhanced and they got better. I mean, there's no question that there's a lot of the stuff. But when they charge one bourbon, let's say, is out there for $40-50, and another one's out there for $300, you have to kind of wonder if it's all that better, or is it just a question of preference? Now, in the world of wine, there is only so much wine that you can make for a first growth in Bordeaux or a Grand Cru in Burgundy. The plot of land will not allow you. But in terms of whiskey, let's face it, they got a lot of grain, they got a lot of malt. There's no shortage of ingredients, And they used to go around saying things like, "Oh, well, to make a true bourbon, it has to be branch water," which means a flowing stream, and it had to be made from a special type of sort of. So I was corn and so on. So I was talking to a guy who ran one of the biggest, not biggest, one of the smallest, but he was, I forget his name now. He's long dead, a big old guy. And I said, "So this is true about the branch water? That's what you?" "Nah, no, that's not true." So what about the corn that's used? "Nah, we just buy it for wherever we want." So there's so many myths about it. But to get back to Dave Broom's book, in this current edition, the third edition, which I highly recommend because it's beautifully photographed, every single plot of land that produces whiskey in some form all over the world is beautifully mapped out, and his prose. But this guy's, and he said, I didn't get to all of them. He says, I have tasted the whiskey from 500 distilleries, which has got to be up by 50% at least from 10 years ago when he started this project. And you say, where is it all coming from? Well, it is coming from an increased interest in bourbons and rums and Irish and Scotch, certainly, and the Japanese. But it's also, I mean, they're making this stuff now everywhere. I mean, just about every country in the world, South Africa and Australia and China and India are all making whiskeys now. And they're not making whiskeys for a grand scale. They're filling these niche markets of people who just want to drink whiskey as a special thing. But as you know, if you have the leverage buyout guys who are going to dinner tonight and they're going to Mastro's Steakhouse or something, let's some of that Glenfiddich, that 30-year-old, and that's $50 a glass. Well, they can put it on the expense account, but I don't know how many people just curl up at night watching I Love Lucy with their wife with a glass like that. In any case, it's a wonderful book. And I asked him, I interviewed him, and I said, "So you at work?" And on the next edition, he says, "No, I'm really, I gotta take a breather here for a while, but he'll be back in 10 years. Of course, he's not a young man now, he's not an old man, but he's gonna be much older in 10 years, given his job. But I highly recommend it. The World Atlas of Whisky, 3rd edition by Dave.
Wow, it's good to know we're not going to run out of any kind of whiskey anytime soon.
There are not. Right?
And also, we thank you for sharing the fact that you can make whiskey any place in the world that you can get a Hanes t-shirt. I'm just saying.
Exactly.
For more on Celebrating Act Two, visit our webpage, follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, And tell your friends, Celebrating Act Two is the user manual for the second half of your life.